Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Writing the Future You Want to See Young Adults panel. We have a lot of talented people today, so let me give a brief presentation of each member before we begin. Here with us is Eric. He goes by the pronouns he, him. Eric is a young adult author and literary agent. As an agent with PS Literary, he's worked on New York Times bestselling and award-winning titles. His latest novel in his author life, Don't Read the Comments, was published with Inkjar Press last year. To learn more about him and the books he works on, visit his official website, ericsmithrocks.com. Then here with us is M.K. Marteens. She goes by the pronouns she, her. M.K. Marteens is the pen name of a bookworm with a PhD in molecular biology. She has over 6 years of experience working in the lab. Exposed to groundbreaking research on a daily basis, she has had a chance to chat with several Nobel Prize winners. Her fictional works are often inspired by science. Her first collection of short stories is currently in the editing stage and due to be published later this year. And last but not least, we also have Ray Toby. They go by the pronouns they, them. Ray Toby is a writer. They received a 2016 and 2017 MAID at Hugo Health Fellowship for their young adult fiction. They created the Young Adult MG Trans and Non-Binary Voices Master List, a database that tracks all books in those age categories written by trans authors about trans characters. They contributed to take the meek fictional stories of everyday resistance. Their first young adult novel, Between Perfect and Real, will be published by Amulet Books on April the 13th, 2021. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to participate on this panel. So the first question I have for you is, what is young adult?
Well, I want to get really technical and say that it was a marketing category that was artificially created, but that's maybe like a little too sassy.
All right. What do you think, Eric?
I mean, for me, young adult novels, you know, they're books that are written for teenagers in that teen voice, right? To serve children, really, right? That's what a young adult author's job kind of is, right? Being there for the kids in their work. They do in my opinion, they do a very specific thing where you have a teen character figuring out who they are, you know, then they're figuring out what the world is like, and then they're figuring out what their place is like in that world, which is kind of the experience of growing up, right? Because that's what young adult is. It's about growing up. That's what YA is to me. I think my son has contrasting opinions and his voice.
Yeah, so basically it's often a coming of an age story. So a story that talks about this journey between being a child and being an adult, and you know what you are in between, and the person that you are becoming on this journey. But also it's often a story about exploration, whether it's introverted exploration of the world within you or exploration of the world around you, often with, you know, realizing a lot of new things about the world, which is also something that you're realizing as you're growing up. You know, you see the world with new eyes, and this is often a theme, or it's basically present in young adult books.
And what is the future you want to see for young adults in every way, but especially in terms of representation?
So I actually in the sense of representation, YA is not so very good, right? I mean, most of the YA stories follow this certain type of character. Very often it's like a brunette girl with brown eyes and white, you know, so it's very, very often it's very stereotypical. But there is some progress in this field, and hopefully there will be more progress in the future. But also one thing that I would like to also talk about is, well, since I have a scientific background, right, I like to also talk about the representation, you know, about people from maybe more scientific background or something like that. You know, I think we sometimes we think about young adults as being still children, but actually they're not children anymore. You know, they're people growing up. So I think very often the themes which are in there are not touching upon a lot of these, you know, discovery and a lot of the interest about the real things in the world. So this is something that as a teen I was missing a lot. You know, the more scientific themes, there was this very hard science fiction, which was always like adults, always men, always, you know, like very, very hard themes in the sense of, you know, adulthood. But then there were no stories in between, like stories which touch upon this real world, real science fiction, but with, you know, younger characters which are just coming out in this world of, you know, science and discovery. And this is something that I'm personally trying to feel. So maybe write more characters which are really interested in science in this age, and also really dealing with, you know, real scientific stuff, because this is when, you know, kids grow up into real persons who are going to do this maybe for the rest of their life.
You brought up a really great point there when you were talking about the age of the characters in the stories. One thing I'd really love to see more in YA are stories that are serving the younger teenagers. You know, we see a lot of young adult books that have characters who are, you know, 15, 16, you know, up to 18, and now we're dabbling in like 19 or so with a lot of the college YA that's coming out. You know, Gloria Chow is doing awesome work in that space. But I'd love to see more YA that I used to see when I was younger, directed at teenagers who were like 13 and 14, because I feel like we're kind of missing them now in this push to make YA novels that appeal to adults, you know, when these books are supposed to be for kids. Some upper middle grade is doing that stuff, but like there are teens that are 13 and 14 who feel like they're a little bit older, and I feel like we need those books for them.
Yeah, I love that. And I totally agree. I'm thinking of a couple book series right now that I just like devoured when I was 13, 14, and we really like don't have that sort of overlap anymore. It's too bad. Yeah, I think for me, obviously one of my passions is trans representation. And I don't know, I think that YA is actually obviously like there's a long way for it to go still, but there's so much exciting work that's being done right now by authors of diverse backgrounds, and people who are really working hard to like give those voices a pathway into publishing and onto shelves. And like this year alone, having tracked them all, there's like 20 plus books coming out by trans authors about trans characters, and that's a really stark difference from past years. Obviously, it's still not enough. Like that's still a really small number of titles, but it feels like, I don't know, I'm sort of a optimist, maybe like an idealist sometimes. And I think that just gives me a lot of encouragement that it feels like things are starting, like the ball is starting to roll a little bit faster. So I'm hoping, like for me in my books, I know that I can't write every identity and I wouldn't want to, and that's not my place, but I want, you know, my book, you know, in my books and every YA book to be a place where like kids like feel seen in some way, even if they're not like themselves represented, and that they don't have to encounter something that is going to like marginalize them or like throw them out of the story of the book or feel like an attack on like who they are as a person. That's the future that like I would like to see.
I love that. I love that. In terms of representation, I'd love to see more neurodivergent books out there, specifically written by neurodivergent authors. That's something I'm looking for a lot in like my literary agent life. You know, my son's neurodivergent, and I can't write stories for him. You know, it's not my place to be his voice, but I can find other people who can hopefully champion little kids like him. So yeah, I'd love to see more representation there, and I'm trying.
That's really cool. And what do you think young adults can do that other age groups or demographics can?
I think like one thing that YA does is take you into a character's internal world in a way that I feel like you don't really get in other fiction and adult fiction, at least not in the same way. It's hard to really like put a finger on what exactly the difference is, but I think like when you're a teen, everything is so heightened. You're experiencing so many things for the first time. Your identity is forming, and I think I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but I think that's something that YA really brings to the table that other genres don't, or other categories don't.
Absolutely. And you said train of thought, which took my train of thought going somewhere, because like I feel like one great thing YA does is just break lots of those literary rules that you see getting, I don't know, like hammered out a little more in adults. I feel like YA does a little bit more, and just kidlit in general, when it comes to like genre blending and just experimenting with different categories. I'm like looking at my bookshelf right now, and I'm looking at like historic YA, written in verse. And what else do I have up here? Nicole Yoon's lovely Everything that has like illustrations throughout all of it that helps tell the story. You don't see adults playing as much as young adult and kidlit authors do, and I wish we did. It would be nice.
Well, one thing, it's maybe this exploration, right? Because exploration is the biggest theme that YA can address, and that maybe other age groups are not necessarily anymore so interested about, because when you're so young, and when a lot of the things that you see are new, you're naturally drawn to things like this. Well, in older age groups, it's mostly romance that becomes very popular, which is also like a big theme in YA. But YA is maybe more approachable for things like exploratory fiction, and weird fiction, and some specific futuristic fantasies, or even some sorts of science fiction, which in adulthood maybe people would not accept well anymore. So I think it's a genre that can explore a lot. And basically that's what it brings to table: exploration.
And how do you see young adult changing in the future? Like, especially, do you think it would shift up or down in age range? And do you think it's fitting or overlapping with new adults? Because there's like this trend, right, that a lot of adult people are reading young adults, and then the characters are kind of older. So
Yeah, I mean, I like, as much as I want those stories for those younger kids, and I want like a return to like getting those like 13 and 14-year-old YA stories that like people like Gordon Corman would write all the time when we were way younger, I do see more older YA hitting. Like, I think we're going to get a lot more like 18, 19-year-olds in college books. I think those are also just as important. Like, those older teens need to see that transitionary stage that you go into when you're off to college and this is the real world, because there's still that traditional coming of age story arc that happens at that moment when you're in college, because now you're in the real world. Surprise, there's still a lot of stuff to figure out. Some of us are in our late 30s and still haven't figured it out, so I feel like we're still going to keep seeing that. I would like to see it go the other way too, though.
Yeah, I actually think that maybe new adult category, which started off and then kind of just disappeared in traditional publishing. Maybe it's a little bit stronger in indie publishing, but in traditional publishing, it's maybe a specific subgenre thing. I think this new adult category should get reestablished, because I mean, there are some themes in young adult which maybe some of the young adult books today are actually not young adult. I sometimes have a feeling that they were written as books for adults, and then just, they slapped on a young adult label because young adult sells better. So I think maybe new adult age group should get reestablished, and there should be some ground rules for YA, especially considering, some topics that maybe you don't want to address in a YA, or maybe that should be addressed more carefully in YA, because literature can have a lot of the impact on developing, young people. And some topics are just not explored in a very good way, in young adult. I mean, there are some examples where like things like PTSD are addressed very, very superficially, and this is something that maybe should get separated into a new adult group. And people should just be more careful when talking to young adults, because this is exactly the age when they're affecting them, and when they can do bad things if they're not careful about addressing some topics and making clear what this is, and just being aware of the kind of effect they can have on these growing adult, growing people.
Yeah, I mean, I think when that kind of stuff is done well in YA, it can be super powerful. Like Brian Bliss writes a lot about PTSD in his YA novels, and Brandy Colbert does as well. So yeah, I think when it's done well, it's amazing. When it's done poorly, it's not great.
I mean, I completely agree with you. I think there should be some ground rules as to, addressing these topics responsibly. So I think this is the main thing, because for adults, you can write whatever you want. Adults already have their, formed worldviews, their formed opinions, and they're gonna just, call you up on bullshit. But for young adults, there should be some sort of responsibility in knowing, these are people growing up. Some certain topics should be addressed in some way, a responsible way. This is, I think, the main thing.
Yeah, and hopefully those authors are doing that. Like I know a lot of writers who do the work to make sure that they're addressing those things in a good way.
Thinking about, I don't know, this ties into a lot of things for me. I think the question of like, what is YA and what is NA, and trying to define those categories is really tricky. I'm thinking of like Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld, which I read and assumed was an adult novel, but then I found it shelved in YA many, many times. And I think Curtis Sittenfeld, I think I remember reading interviews with her where she talked about like maybe that she felt like it was, marketed incorrectly, or that was like a decision that the publisher made, which I found really interesting. And I also do think, like, I remember being 18, and 18 is not like a magical age where you suddenly become an adult and have the same faculties as like I do now at 31. Like I have changed a lot since that time. And even at like 21, I still felt mentally closer to 18 than I did to say like 25. And I absolutely think that like 18, 19-year-olds are still like, they're still teenagers. They're still kids figuring it out. And they are part of YA, even like early 20s folks. And I also think it's like, it's really wonderful that like adults are reading YA. And I think that's especially true for like queer people and trans people, because we didn't have representation, at least like I did not have representation as a queer teen. And so like I love reading YA to like get the stories and get the like the reflection of my experiences that I didn't have and that I'm still hungry for. I think that like we definitely like we need to keep the focus on like teens in YA, but it's not a bad thing that adults are reading YA. And like sort of talking through all of my thoughts that have come up with this discussion. Yeah, and the question of like how topics should be dealt with in YA, I think that's like another point to why representation is so important and why it's so important to have people with those experiences writing those stories, because kids have PTSD, like, and it's hard to, it's different for mental health and neurodivergence to be out about those things, like it's okay to have boundaries and like not want to share that you have PTSD, but still write about it. And you shouldn't have to like be out about your mental health in order to do that. And I, at the same time, I have also read like one of the first books that I read in this past year or so that has OCD rep, and I have OCD, was written by someone who doesn't have OCD. I'm not like, the book wasn't perfect, but it represented my experience relatively well. And that person had clearly done their research, even if they took some liberties that I didn't really agree with. So I don't know. Like, I think that all of these things are complex, and it's not, I don't think there can be any rules, unfortunately. Like, I think there are guidelines, like there are things that we should try to like respect and promote. And we should make YA a safer place for folks to be out about their mental health stuff. But saying that like things have to be written about in a certain way can, I think, sometimes exclude a lot of those things from actually happening in YA. It's just, yeah, I think it's kind of a balance.
Like, is it valid to represent other people in your writing, even if it's not you, like people that maybe are close to you, but you are not them? Like, for example, having an homosexual side character, something like that. Like, is it valid? How should one go about it? Because it's an issue that a lot of writers are interested, like right now. They want their novels to be diverse, but they don't know like how to go around it and how to include everyone without being disrespectful, and like without trying to tell a story that isn't theirs to tell. So
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like all writers should write in a way that's, you know, reflective of the world around them, you know? Like, it shouldn't be a big scary thing to say like, oh, I should really include some diverse characters in this book, because that's what your world should be like, right? You should be writing about your friends and the people who surround you. You know, my worry is that if you don't have a lot of diverse and inclusive friends, I don't know if you're the person that should be writing that book, you know? Like, you should have that lived experience with these people in your life to want to include them in your fiction. So like, you know, my advice is write your world. That's and reflect it in your work. But if it doesn't look like that around you, I don't know if you're the one that should be writing it.
I have whenever I try to write, you know, like a narrow, diverse character, or any sort of experience that I don't have personally, I always include or try to search for sensitivity readers. I think this is an absolute must-have. So everyone who is trying to write about experience that they don't personally have should have a sensitivity reader, and also, if it's possible, beta readers, multiple beta readers with such experience who are fine with reading such content. Because for sensitivity readers, what is the difference between having a beta reader with such experience and sensitivity reader? A beta reader is someone who is just here to read your book and to basically give you some sort of feedback, but people with such experience can find some topics perhaps triggering. So sensitivity reader is someone who you are paying to do this and to look through it and to find any sort of possible triggering topics and clear them out, so that, you know, people with different experiences are not triggered by this. So I think number one should be having a sensitivity reader, and then once you've cleared all the obvious stuff that, you know, perhaps even accidentally happen because you don't have this experience, then you can try to find other beta readers who would be willing to read your work, and then, you know, then you are ready for showing this in the world. Yeah.
I think what Eric said really resonates with me, and that's like a rule that I try to keep to when I write, is like, I'm writing, you know, people that I know in my community. Like I'm not writing them, but I'm writing like this is something that I see and experience in my day-to-day life, and people who I interact with and people who I'm friends with. And also thinking about like my high school experience, like, thinking about the diversity of my friend group, like this is how, like this is the world that I write my books. And then also like having worked with teens relatively recently, like within the past 5 years, like writing what their worlds look like and what the classrooms look like that I worked in, and like what the students, like who the students are that I worked with. Like for instance, it's very common for there to be all queer and all trans like friend groups now, which was not common when I was a kid because no one was out. And some people find that unrealistic, but it's actually very realistic, at least in Seattle. And so I just like try to pull from the world around me and the world that I live in and the people that I like move with. And sensitivity readers are an interesting question too. Like I am a sensitivity reader for trans and queer rep, and I have them for my book. And I think it's another interesting place where I think it's a little more nuanced than maybe the conversation that always happens on Twitter, because I think that in an ideal world, like people should be able to get sensitivity readers for the characters that they're writing that aren't of their own experience, but it's also an access barrier financially. Like I couldn't afford to have sensitivity readers until I had a publisher who would pay for my sensitivity readers. I think, and that was important to me, and that was something I was prepared to advocate for with my agent and my publisher. Like I was not going to send my book to publication until they were willing to pay for sensitivity readers. Fortunately, I have a wonderful publisher who upfront was like, we have a budget for this. And I was like, great. But I also think like, if you are unable to financially access sensitivity readers, it's important to like really work on your critical thinking skills and your humility. And like Eric said, writing the world that surrounds you and not jumping off and having like a savior mentality of like, I need to help the queer teens, I need to help the Black teens, like I need to write, like critical thinking, humility, like reading works by folks about the characters that you want to represent. There are lots of ways that people can like make themselves better writers until they can meet that like the financial, like I don't know what the word is, but until they can like afford a sensitivity reader. Yeah.
And like you said so many great things there about just like doing the homework, and how important that is. And I feel like it's also so important for writers to remember that like a sensitivity reader isn't like, they're not like your all access pass to being able to do these things, right? Like no one's experience is like monolithic. Like there's not just this one person that's going to say, yes, this is the experience for everybody. Like I write about adoption a lot in my stories because I'm adopted. That's how someone named Eric Smith looks the way I do. And I get asked to do sensitivity reads pretty frequently, for like adoption rep and everything. And, I always say like, just a heads up, like, this is good, this is bad, whatever it is, but I'm telling you this from my experience, and my experience is going to be wildly different from someone that's an adoptee in another state or got adopted at another age. There's so many things that change based on someone's experience. So like, just because you got that one sensitivity reader for your book, like there's still probably homework to do, like Ray was saying there, with all the reading and everything.
Yeah, that's really a great advice. Are there any trends in young adults that you think could be traced to current events?
I mean, I think we saw like a pretty like interesting surge in like YA political books, in the last like year or so. Like Becky Albertalli and Aisha Saeed had that amazing, is it like Yes, No, Maybe So? I can probably find it on my bookshelf. Yes, Yes, No, Maybe So. And I know Katie Katungo had one. Brandy Colbert wrote that voting booth book. So yeah, there's a bump in those politics books with young people getting involved and using their voices, which I thought was wonderful. We've always had those, that there have been some other ones that have been really great in the last few years, but you definitely saw that like big bump in like protest books and political books, and yeah, it was great. You gotta reflect the world around you for the kids.
Yes, I have to say, Eric, I'm really jealous of your bookshelf because you keep just like pulling these books down that I like really want to read. You just like have them on hand. But yeah, I totally agree. That's what I was thinking of too, is like, I remember like when I was a kid, I went to Iraq War protests, and like I had friends who were organizing walkouts and stuff like that. And kids, and today too, like I've seen the teens that I've worked with, like organizing protests and walkouts, and like this is something that kids do. And they are very like active and involved, and I love like what you said, all the like upsurge books where kids go to protests and are part of protests. It's like it's so exciting.
Ray,
Yeah.
did you read Adi Al-Said's We Didn't Ask for This?
No, I haven't.
I've been trying to get like all my YA friends to read it because it's like teens staging like environmental protest in like a high school lock-in, but it like breaks all the rules of YA because it jumps around through like 40 different characters' heads throughout the entire book. It's really remarkable.
Yes, I love that. That's something that I would love to see more of too, is like that sort of playing, or like what I think is a trend. And what I'd love to see even more and more of is like that, like breaking with form and breaking with like I remember, I think a piece of advice I received early on that I think is valuable is like, think really carefully before you make your novel a multi-POV novel. It like really needs to be serving the story. And I also love when authors are just like, no, like I'm gonna do like this works, and like there's a purpose for this, and like when you can see like so much more of the story and it serves the story to do that, like I love. So good.
So someone wanted to ask you on the Discord that they are concerned that there's the future they want to see in young adults. Like the question was, what is the future you want to see in young adults doesn't currently match the market? Should you write a book that could be considered unsellable by the publishing industry in general?
That's hard, because one question I get asked a lot, because I'm someone that like works in the industry as well as writes, is like, does your industry mind influence your writer mind? And like I really wish it did, because it doesn't. And like I come up with novel ideas that I know are unsellable, but I write them anyway because like maybe this will be the book that breaks that rule. And I just talked about like Adi's wild, outrageous 40 POV YA novel. Like I feel like if I got pitched that in my agent life, I'd be like, oh, I don't know, this feels unsellable. But then something happens and proves us all wrong. I say go for it personally. Just make sure you know what the rules are in the market before you try to break them. Like read widely, be familiar with what's out there, because when you are, that's when you're able to make those shifts kind of happen. So yeah, do your thing. Ignore the market. Even though my agent brain is like, no, don't do that, but that's just how I work.
I think that just the fact that there are so many underrepresented groups shows that, market is maybe or has been very bad at, estimating what can be sold and what is the market. So I think, especially, so I'm going to go for indie publishing. And if you're going indie, if you feel there is, some group that is underrepresented, some group, that would like to read about the story that you wrote, just go ahead, publish it, especially if you're going self-publishing route. You are going to have to make a lot of marketing one way or another. So try it.
Sorry, Eric. It's so funny when you unmute.
I feel like all my favorite YA breaks all those big rules though. Like I was just thinking about Adi, and then I look back to my shelf again, and like I'm looking at like Kayla Ancram's like The Wicker King, which is like told in like this odd sparse verse kind of style of writing, which like I feel like breaks a ton of rules in YA, because it's not quite poetry, but it kind of is, and it's just it's completely unlike anything else that's really out there. And then I know I pulled Nicola Yoon's Everything out, and that book has illustrations in it. And like when you hear about YA novels, like people are like, oh no, you don't put illustrations in books for teenagers, but sometimes you do, and they work awesome. Oh boy, yeah, no, just break some rules. Go for it.
Yeah, like I think that, like, for me, I thought my book was unsellable, and I thought that I, as an author, was unsellable. Being like a trans person, non-binary person, writing about like a trans character coming out, because part of that was because I was like not yet part of the YA community, and I like hadn't been like in touch with like all the changes that had been happening since I was a kid and read those books. And I'm really fortunate, like I came to Twitter and like found DV Pit and like quickly learned that there like was a place for me and that people were like, you know, championing Voice's work. And I think that's part of it too, is like you never, like what Eric is saying, like you never know what will actually be sellable. And sometimes you just have to be prepared to wait longer, unfortunately. Like you might just have to query a lot before you find the right agent who is like really passionate and wants to champion you, or like until you decide that like self-publishing is the way that you want to go, or indie publishing is the way that you want to go instead. But I think it's worth it because, you know, like MK said, you're going to have to do a lot of marketing either way, and you want to love the thing that you're marketing. If you're like, here's the thing that I wrote that I know would sell, yay, my book, versus like, this is the thing that I wrote that I love, you know, make it something that you are passionate about.
All right. There was also this question about trigger warnings. It was kind of controversial, and they said, what do you think about trigger warnings? Should your book have trigger warnings? Isn't that spoilers? And like they were concerned it would like by adding trigger warnings, they would be spoiling the book.
I think they're great. You don't want to subject a reader to something that's going to make them wildly uncomfortable or experience some pain there. I was lucky enough to work with this author, Adam Sass, on his book, Surrender Your Sons. And there's an awesome author's note in front of it that kind of tells you, like, these are the things that are going to happen in this book. It doesn't tell you what the plot of the book is. That's not going to ruin the story. It just tells you these certain things are in here, and you might find them difficult to experience. I think that's fine. That to me shows a sensitivity to your reader and your audience. And that's like super important and valuable. In my agent life, every now and again, I get query letters that are like, hey, I'd love for you to check out my book, but just a quick content warning, this book is going to include X, Y, and Z. And sometimes that makes me want to read it more because I know that this person already cares about their potential readership. Yeah, when you're writing for kids, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think content warnings are important. And I also think ideally, like the copy of your book and the blurbs of your book should also give the reader some kind of heads up as to like what they might expect in those pages. Like, especially like thinking back again to like folks with PTSD, and as someone who has people that I love in my life with PTSD, like sometimes things that can trigger that are like not advertised or like not hinted at in the copy of the book, and that can be really upsetting for someone to just like stumble across. And I think that's like worth it for adult books to consider too. And like trigger warnings, unfortunately there's been a lot of discourse that has made it so that what those are like really misunderstood. But like a trigger warning is not for like, a homophobic person who doesn't want to read about like gay people. Like if that makes you uncomfortable, like great. Like I'm not gonna like forewarn you, even though you will have forewarning because my books are very gay. But like, content warnings are for things that will cause people to have actual like trauma reactions when they read them, flashbacks, or dissociation, or just like to some degree, like there's a vast spectrum on which those things occur, and the like types of trauma responses that you can have. So I think that they're very important to have.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I would even argue they can be good for your book, because you don't want to, upset your readers. Upsetting your reader also means that maybe they never ever pick up your book again. And, just putting in a simple trigger warning beforehand can tell them, okay, heads up, there is something that you might not be comfortable with in this book, but in some other books, it won't be there, right? So I think they can even be good for you as a writer.
And are there any young adult tropes you'd advise people to avoid or that you'd like to see less of?
No. I think that like there's always a fresh way to spin a trope, and especially for folks who have traditionally been marginalized out of publishing, like, we haven't gotten a chance to write those tropes yet. Like, I think it's fair game. Write whatever you want. There's going to be someone who loves that trope who wants to read that book. Unless they're like racist tropes, like don't do that.
That's it, just explore all the tropes you want, have a good time. Yeah, but the racist stuff, hard pass. I don't want to see a redemption arc for your racist guy. Like I'm good.
I would just like to maybe add toxic relationships to that list of don't do tropes. So I think this is something that is maybe even overdone in YA, and this is maybe something that should lessen.
Yeah, that's great. I've seen a lot of toxic, well, I've read a lot of toxic relationships in young adults. You're right. And how can we better reflect our personal struggles in our writing?
So there's this wonderful author named Erin Bowman. She writes books across every genre and category you can imagine. And I actually don't have it on my shelf. Darn it. Usually I can just pluck one out like that. But she had this great book called Contagion that came out like 2 years ago. That was like an Edgar nomination. Amazing. But in her newsletter a couple of years ago, she had this thing about how some of the best writing she does is a result of mining her life, and for me, that's the way to show my personal struggles in my own writing is mining my life. I write a lot about adoption. Don't read the comments as about racism and cyber harassment. Like I pull from my own life experiences to talk about those big struggles. And I think that's the way to go about it. I think it's really important though to have a good support system when it comes to doing that as a writer. Make sure you have a good writing group, make sure you have a friend you could bounce stuff off of. What you're writing is making you cry and you're having a really hard time with it, just take a break. Make sure you're surrounding yourself with people that care about you, because sometimes minding your life, it's not all digging up diamonds. Sometimes it's a lot of coal and it hurts.
Yeah, I think as someone who also like minds their life for their books, it's really important to have boundaries. And like Eric said, like, take care of yourself in doing that. None of my books are autobiographical. I always think about, I was in the Tin House workshop in a presentation with Morgan Parker, who's absolutely brilliant. And she was like, like, I forget exactly what she said, but she was talking about how like writing from your life doesn't mean that it's like the autobiographical facts are in there, like the feelings are in there. So I think it's really important to have boundaries about like, this is in the pages of the book, but it doesn't mean that I like am going to talk about it in an interview or like on my Instagram page, or that I'm going to talk about it in the same way, or that I have to be like open about, like we were talking about earlier, you shouldn't have to be out about anything really to like justify you writing from your personal experience. And I think there's been a lot of unfortunate instances of authors feeling like they have to be more open than they want to be. I'm thinking of like Becky Albertalli and like the way people have treated her. And I don't know. I think like, yeah, boundaries.
I agree with everything that was said before. So maybe I would just like to add that, you know, everyone should know that author does not equal character, and author does not equal book. And, you know, this is something that everyone should understand, even when it comes from a personal experience. So one thing that I like to do is I like to add a snippet of personal experience or feelings to every single character that I write, and then I also add something else, you know, some other aspect to this character. So it's kind of like sprinkling your feelings and your experience across all of your books, instead of, you know, putting all out at once.
Do you have any advice for new writers who want to write young adult, or writers who have written something else but want to dive into the genre?
You should read young adult. Read like a lot of young adult. Like when I sort of first came into the like YA community with Between Perfect and Real, like I hadn't engaged in both like that like publishing community, and I hadn't been reading a lot of current YA, and I quickly like got up to speed, and that influenced like the way that I revised Between Perfect and Real, and it's very different now, and my writing style is different now, and I am a better writer because I read a lot of YA and a lot of current YA. And yeah, that would be my advice.
Yeah, you said something really great there where you said current YA, I have, I don't know, when you're an author, you have a lot of friends that are like, I'm going to write a book now. And will tell you like the last children's book they read was, Lord of the Rings or something. And it's like, well, things have changed. Not a kid's book. Let's discuss. So yeah, read current books, read as voraciously as you can. That's what's gonna get you used to what the voice is like, and what's on the shelf, and what rules there are, and how close your narrator should be. That's how you're going to figure out where it is you want to be writing. Whether you decide you want to write YA, or whether you want to write literary fiction, or essay collections or memoir. You should be reading in those spaces to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, read and also maybe listen to the community of the readers, because there were so many things missed before. Maybe there are also some other things which are still missing out there, and now it's much easier, to hear the voices of the readers and to see if there is something that you can contribute here, add something valuable to the YA genre. You don't need to perpetuate just the same old story. You can get creative and listen to the readers. So read, but also try to be creative and think creatively, what might be still missing.
Also be patient. The publishing process, it's this business where like nothing happens and then suddenly everything happens and then nothing happens again, and it's this really weird experience. Like I have authors in my agent life whose books took me 2 years to sell as their agent. Sometimes it takes 2 years to find an agent, so it could take a long time to get there. So just be patient, kick around the next idea that you have, and yeah, just have a good writing group to experience the ride with, because it's a ride, but it's a lot better when you have a lot of people with you. Like a roller coaster. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was really great.